Recognizing Leader of the Third Party.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. It's a delight to see you in the chair. I rise to take my place to respond to this year's budget. The Minister of Finance delivered the budget speech yesterday and spoke of British Columbians who lent a hand when needed in the never-ending crises of last year, and it's true, I agree, that people in this province care deeply for each other and the communities that they live in. It's a tremendously special place to live. I'm deeply grateful to the residents of Cowichan Valley who themselves worked tirelessly over this past year, and particularly during the floods, and kept the community connected, fed, housed, governed, entertained, fit, clothed, and safe. Crises such as we are facing can reveal the character of a place and its people, and the people of Cowichan and British Columbia have demonstrated incredible strength of character. As we continue to deal with COVID-19, the toxic drug crisis, and housing deficits, British Columbians deserve a budget that is honest about where we're at. When I stood last year to respond to Budget 2021, I spoke about how hard 2020 had been. And as I stand today, I have to recognize that the past year was even more difficult than the year before. Soon after the budget was delivered yesterday, we learned that 44 British Columbians died over the Family Day weekend from COVID. The pandemic is not over. The climate crisis is worsening. Heat domes, fires, floods irreparably damaged our communities. We've lost lives to yet another record-setting number of British Columbians due to inaction on the drug poisoning crisis. The pandemic worsened, and people have become increasingly unclear about what our collective goals are. Our access to healthcare services and public health tools were restricted, and our communities have become, in some cases, isolated and divided. It has been a year of compounding hardship. Ottawa Public Health came out yesterday with a statement of compassion for how people are feeling in this moment. They recognize that everyone is not fine. And the reality is exactly that. We are not fine. Life feels like it is getting harder. People are feeling let down by those whom they elected. The democratic institutions we have built are growing less and less accountable and transparent, and people are feeling removed from the processes of these places. Social media is full of angst and division and misinformation, and many people are overwhelmed at the state of the world and feeling powerless to change what is happening. And I know that all of our constituency assistants, people who spend their days trying to help the citizens of this province navigate provincial services, all of them have been on the receiving end of rage. The government touted the 2022 budget released yesterday as a climate budget. It certainly used the right words on the climate crisis and inequality, but a government's budget has to do more than just try to tell a good news story. It must tell the truth of what people are feeling. The story this government is trying to tell does not reflect the reality that British Columbians are experiencing. A government shows you their priorities by how they spend their money, not with what they say. And by and large, this NDP government prioritized the status quo in Budget 2022. When reading through the budget, we have to ask, who does this budget leave behind? Last year, we pointed out that the budget was lacking focus on climate change and inequality. This year, government took our criticism to heart. We see a recognition of the severity of impacts from climate change and some appropriate responses, like a year-round wildfire service, and recognition of the need for flood mitigation and increased capacity at climate-related monitoring stations. However, these are responses to the emergency as it unfolds. What we need is to reduce what's generating that emergency and shift how we measure our economy and what we value. The Minister of Finance said yesterday that, quote, a strong economy creates meaningful opportunities for everyone. Our economy should be serving the needs of everyone and strengthening the fabric of society, the well-being of people, of the environment, of our democratic systems. But today's reality in British Columbia is that the economy works largely for those who are wealthy. Someone can only be as successful as their economic position lets them be. But our economy should be focused on building more equality, on serving the well-being of people, and not overlooking those who need support the very most. This government might be using the right words when talking about equality and opportunity, but it doesn't adequately invest in making these a reality. They continue to rely on revenues from the very causes of the crises we face, profiting from the housing market and oil and gas royalties. Whenever goods and services exchange hands, GDP increases. That means that the cost of rebuilding the Coquihalla, an increase in fracking, the cost of wildfire management, all of these inflate GDP and contribute to a so-called healthy economy. But I would argue this is not a healthy economy at all. Growth continues to be how we measure success, but we know that the current rates of growth contribute to the crash that we are seeing in biodiversity, to species loss, to ecological breakdown. Again, this cannot be seen as a healthy economy. We are trying to build on a cracked foundation. We have to be able to imagine how to measure things differently. The way that we measure and what we value and the stories we tell have gotten us to this place where people feel a disconnect from the institutions that they believe should be serving them. So how do we measure differently? We have long been advocating for the use of genuine progress indicators that focus on social ties, on well-being, on the health of the environment as markers for a strong economy. We have seen countries like New Zealand introduce health and well-being budgets that demonstrate that this is absolutely possible. And while this government uses the right words on measuring our economy differently in Budget 2022, they continued to emphasize GDP and GDP alone as the benchmark. As long as we stick to what has been done in the past, we are going to keep getting the same outcomes and the same kinds of budgets from governments. The budget was not without positive steps forward. The $2.1 billion investment into emergency management is a welcome step to building back the communities that were devastated by climate events in 2021. While less than half of that was targeted towards strengthening our communities, this government has laid a path forward to making BC more resilient. I hope that next year's budget increases spending on adaptation to the climate crisis. Other positive elements of the budget included stabilizing Sexual Assault Center funding, funding the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act Secretariat, and creating a dedicated ministry for land, water, and resource stewardship. The record-setting investment into addressing homelessness is a step towards meeting the basic right to housing that all British Columbians should expect. I'm also pleased to see this government build some continuity of care for children aging out of the child welfare system, creating $600 a month rental supplements until the age of 27 will create the stability for some of the most vulnerable people in our province. And while these are positive investments, there are more significant gaps in Budget 2022, and you can see these gaps by identifying what the government chose not to talk about. For example, Budget 2022 made little investment into strengthening the education system. The increases in K-12 funding are the result of increased enrollment. The government breezed over the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the impacts of those who develop long COVID and the implications for them, their lives, their ability to work long into the future, and the implications for our economy. Similarly, Budget 2022 made no mention of those with disabilities. For being so-called inclusive and equal budget, this was a gaping hole in the government's priorities. The budget mentioned anti-racism and how diverse our province is, but made no mention of the rise of racism that we've seen over the last years. The NDP applauded themselves for reducing the poverty rate without recognizing that affordability is getting worse and with inflation and weakening supply chains, and that for people they are having to make very stark choices when they go to the grocery store. There's a lack of vision for our healthcare system. We know that those who are poorer and in worse health are seeing less outcomes from the healthcare system. And while this budget invested in more urgent care centers, it did little to protect our healthcare system from creeping corporatization and did little to keep nurses in the field. It did little to make it easier to be a family doctor, providing lifelong care to patients, which we know is the form of healthcare that is best for people. What is shocking was the lack of investment into dealing with the toxic drug crisis when we had 2,224 people die from a poisonous drug supply last year, no investment into an expanded safe supply for the thousands of British Columbians who use drugs, a government that calls itself inclusive and caring for all British Columbians seems to feel no urgency to address the fact that 7 people are dying every day from a poison drug supply. The budget did little to recognize the mental health crisis we have before us a year after making a $500 million investment into our mental health system. Where have we succeeded? Psychiatric emergency units across the province should not be the place where people are accessing mental health care. And yet people are without access to counseling, to therapy. Youth are facing month-long wait lists to see a counselor in their school. And so the question is, what has improved from that investment? Without preventative mental health care, we cannot really pretend that things are getting better for British Columbians. This budget promised to reduce taxes on electric vehicles. But reducing taxes on electric vehicles, even used ones, is not how we transform our transportation system. Accessible, dependable, affordable public transit should be at the center of transportation. We should be building communities that meet people's basic needs within a 15-minute walk or bike ride, focusing on people, not on cars. There are cities around the world, governments around the world that are leaning into these solutions, that are creating more livable, more sustainable, more people-centered communities. And we could absolutely be doing that here. But it's not by encouraging people to buy more cars. From my point of view, we measure progress in society by how we care for our most vulnerable. More and more people in British Columbia are feeling vulnerable, from their mental health to their access to primary health care, to their protection in a global pandemic, to their physical safety from climate disasters. We need to recognize that. People are feeling more and more disaffected by government, in part because they don't feel the benefits of government in their lives. And it begs the question, what is the role and purpose of government in people's lives? If people are not feeling cared for, are we collectively doing our jobs? This is a status quo budget. For the government to move British Columbians into the future, they need to stop making discrete policy shifts. They need to know where they're heading and support British Columbians who need it most. I think a lot about a vision for the future. We do policy work, we focus on what we want to raise in this House. But that policy work falls under an umbrella of a vision for the future. It's a vision where people's basic needs are met. Food, shelter, clean water, community. And where the communities that we live in are thriving and healthy and connected. Where our natural systems that we depend on for our health and well-being are themselves thriving, and where government and public institutions are trustworthy. I want a budget that sets the goal for the future, that makes the investments to get us there, and then measures our progress on the path to that future. I want a budget that makes reducing inequality the centerpiece of climate action. I want a budget that prioritizes people's access to lifelong health care, including mental health. I want a budget that stops 7 people a day dying preventable deaths. I want a budget that isn't relying on revenue from the housing crisis or having a hand in the oil and gas industry's cookie jar. I want a budget that recognizes that things are not okay right now, and then shines a light, a beacon for all of us, for a world that has more certainty, more stability, and recognizes the important role of building trust for the government that is delivering that. Budget 2022 was the time to show urgency and real vision beyond incremental shifts, but ultimately, that's not what we got. I hope that we can recognize the importance of acknowledging the challenges that we face today, developing that vision for the future, and ensuring that we are measuring properly the path to get there. Thank you.